My earliest memories of video games were the sights, sounds, and smells of my local arcade and the convenience stores and laundromats that also carried them. It was at these smoky, poorly lit dives that my interest in the hobby blossomed, a story where the first chapters were written by a ravenous yellow ghost eater and a girlfriend-stealing gorilla. Pretty much everything was impressive to me in those early days. I didn't need a reason to play these games. Heck, I didn't need a reason to just stand there and watch them get played by other people. I felt lucky to just know they existed, to be a part of their world, and to hear their tunes lure me to sleep at night as the memories of the day washed over me. The technology changed so fast that I was seeing new levels of graphics and sound almost every time I walked into an arcade. It seemed every month some new title appeared that knocked my socks off. Sometimes the leap was so incredible, it seemed like something out of a science fiction film. It was almost like a drug, the excitement of walking into a place with a new arcade machine, just knowing you were about to see some bleeding-edge technology on display. That endorphin rush was real. Everything changed for me at home when I moved away from Atari's 2600 and got my NES in 1986. All of a sudden, there was another group of games to capture my imagination. They didn't look quite as good as what I was seeing in the arcade, but much of it was original and the gameplay could be every bit as entertaining. It was during this platform transition that the familiar rush of seeing new types of visual effects and hearing new types of music became so very clear. What I had loved about arcade gaming was recreated during a new console generation. The euphoria of new games, new graphics, new special effects, a new console generation hit all the same notes. That inspired me to make the video you are about to see. Here we are going to take a look at the shift between the various console generations over the years. I've chosen some games that really hit home with me on how much more powerful the new hardware was. This is about my own personal journey and comes straight from the heart. I hope you guys enjoy it. The Atari 2600 was the very first console I was exposed to. Originally released in 1977, I was just 2 years old when this bad boy hit the US market. As you can imagine, I was a bit too young to buy and play it by myself, so it was my father that handled the duties on this one. Most of my earliest memories here are of games like Space Invaders, Pong, and Combat. For a stretch of time, I didn't mind the 2600, mainly because there were some good titles and I mostly played with my dad. But compared to the arcade versions, this machine started coming up short in its later years, and by the time the Great Gaming Crash hit in 1983, most of the new games available were absolute trash. I was turned off so much that I actually stopped playing console games for a number of years. Yes, it really did get that bad. It wasn't until the NES came along that my passion for home gaming was relit. What may seem funny today was no joke back when it was released. The NES brought so many new norms to the table, especially by late 1986 when I scored mine. What had started as simply avoiding obstacles in titles like Pitfall transitioned to full-on side-scrolling adventures like Super Mario Bros. The interactions increased as well. Instead of just avoiding enemies, you could jump on top of them, kick them across the screen, and even break apart the environment to a degree. Shoot-em-ups went from a few colors here and there for details to backgrounds that actually looked like it had houses, buildings, trees, and much more. It was also really nice how the new detail conveyed a great sense of personality. Faces became expressive, bodies had more animation, and your actions looked so much more natural. It was also incredibly cool how the new genres in the arcade felt perfectly at home on the NES. What would have been incredibly rudimentary on the 2600 came with more moves, more graphical variety, and far more detail. Story and character development also saw a big boom on the NES thanks to its increased capabilities. Images looked like the stuff you saw in comic books, and it was really nice to see games starting to take things closer to a real, multifaceted entertainment experience. It was also just nice that the visuals actually looked like what they were supposed to. When you played something like Batman, the Caped Crusader was well represented, as was the dingy concrete jungle of Gotham City. But the one area where I appreciated the NES the most was the music. It was here that I realized that sound could be just as important as the visuals. It could drag you deeper into the experience and make you feel closer to the action, the story, and elevate the entire journey in a way no previous hardware could compare. For 3 years, this little gray box was my gateway to countless new worlds, memorable characters, and I came away adoring it. As my time with the NES came to a close, the rise of 16-bit console technology began to take hold. In 1989, the Sega Genesis and the TurboGrafx-16 both launched in the United States, and boy did my world get a lot bigger. These new machines brought along technology that could display so much more color, much larger sprites, more background layers, and detail that went far beyond anything I had seen before. Those early 16-bit games may look simple by today's standards, but at the time, they filled me with an excitement that made me want to see as much of it as humanly possible. At first, I was in awe of simple effects like line and parallax scrolling. I always loved the look of this stuff and felt it added depth that could look almost three-dimensional. Whether it was water, clouds, trees, mountains, or whatever, I was drawn to replaying stages that did it well. Sometimes I was able to appreciate a game just because it splashed so much color on the screen that your eyes got lost in all the detail. Some games did all this so well it came together in an orgiastic feast for the senses. When the Super Nintendo launched in 1991, it brought with it a few new technologies that really stood out. The first was what Nintendo called Mode 7, which was just a fancy way of saying it could scale and rotate a background plane. And those early games offered a staggering visual appeal. You hadn't seen an effect so convincing since Sega doubled down on sprite scaling so heavily in their arcade titles. Entire playfields could be manipulated in a way that made them look and feel three-dimensional. Games like Pilot Wings and F-Zero were so impressive, I played them for months, basking in an experience you couldn't get outside of an arcade. Sometimes Nintendo and its third parties used it as a simple gimmick, but even then you always appreciated it whenever it had screen time. But the 16-bit era was more than just graphical effects, because along with it came a massive improvement in sound. At first it was the brilliant tracks belted out by Sega's FM synthesis. Even though sometimes it could be hit or miss, those early Genesis releases were aurally fantastic. The Revenge of Shinobi, Golden Axe, E-SWAT, Thunder Force 3, Granada, and so many others. Even the TurboGrafx had numerous games with outstanding sound and music. And the thing is that it was very different from the stuff you were hearing on the Genesis. Completely. The two machines offered their own brand of sound that had a unique identity. A unique feel that defined the experience so incredibly well. And then later on, the Super Nintendo again added to everything that had made 16-bit technology so exciting. Their custom Sony sound chip was created to mimic real instruments, with much of its offerings sounded like someone had locked a small orchestra inside your console. What was so brilliant about all this is that again it was very specific. So you had not one, not two, but 3 consoles that all sounded unique. When you had the best of the Genesis, you had a soundtrack that could not be duplicated by the others. And the same with the TurboGrafx, and the same with the Super Nintendo. Each one had a distinct sound, such a unique experience, I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. This generation taught me to appreciate those distinctions, and put forth my best effort to play as much as possible to see it all. While I always preferred the Genesis, I never shied away from the others and their games. It was during this time I got my very first paying job, which made owning more than one console a reality for the very first time. And believe me, I tried owning as much as I possibly could. The beginning of the 32-bit era began for me in 1994 when I got a Panasonic 3DO. This new console had been released in October of 1993, but there were no real games for it for months. By the summer, however, some powerhouse releases began hitting the 3DO and made it an absolute blast. It was at this time that you started to see the rise of polygon visuals. This was radically different from the sprite and background scaling we had seen in the previous generations. Polygons were nothing new, mind you, but we were seeing some radical advances in the technology. Textured mapping gave environments so much more detail, and things were smoother and faster than ever before. When we began to see a taste of this with games like Road Rash, the possibilities were plain as day. Everything we had known about video games was about to change in a very big way. Those games I played on the 3DO in 1994 prepared me for this. The Need for Speed was a look at racing games as they'd be in the very near future. Alone in the Dark was my first taste of survival horror. Crash and Burn for car combat. These early titles were paving the way for just how much potential this technology possessed. But it wasn't just polygons the 3DO impressed me with. When I got my hands on Super Street Fighter II Turbo, I was also shown that 32-bit technology was about to bring me closer to the arcade than I had ever been before. 2D graphics got a massive boost in color and animation, making previous home ports look laughable in comparison. Of course, the 3DO was but a drop in the bucket of things to come. At the end of 1994, the Saturn and PlayStation began their assault upon the market, first hitting Japan and then the rest of the world in the following year. What 3DO had started, they doubled down on. Polygon games received another big boost in presence thanks to the power of these two new machines. Sega was bringing home polygon ports I had just been blown away by in the arcade mere months before, and 2D games were practically indistinguishable from their coin-op cousins. The excitement during this time was unreal. You salivated over every new release because it often meant having the arcade in your home like never before. Once we got past arcade ports, things arguably got even better. These games weren't made elsewhere and whittled down to fit lesser hardware. This stuff was made to take advantage of that hardware as it was, and the results were often tantalizing, if not outright more impressive. Again, two-dimensional games were a big part of this. While you can look at Capcom's arcade ports and be blown away, can you say something like Guardian Heroes or Dragon Force didn't do the same? It was a magical time where the hobby was growing and changing fast, and new genres were being born all the time. This was definitely the case when the Nintendo 64 showed up in 1996. Mario 64 was such an advancement on the idea of a three-dimensional platformer that it single-handedly reinvented it. I had never played anything like it. It was so smooth and instantly accessible, like the genre had existed for years prior. It would be the backbone and inspiration for countless games to come. Nintendo also landed the incredible Zelda Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64. This time it was the 3D adventure games they intended to redefine, and again, they hit a home run. Looking back, it's easy to dismiss this generation because much of the 3D has aged so poorly. Advances in resolution and memory quickly made the 32-bit era a laughingstock in terms of presentation. Not even nostalgia can combat this effectively, but I still have incredibly fond memories all the same. It brought so many firsts, and I still dabble in its wares quite often. The last era we will be looking at in this episode is the 6th generation of consoles, which was spearheaded by Sega's Dreamcast. The transition to this time was incredibly special because we saw a massive uptick in polygon rendering quality. In the previous generation, consoles like the PlayStation and Saturn had low-res textures, low polygon counts, and few special effects that made things look even remotely realistic. When Dreamcast launched, we saw an increase in all these areas that really made a huge difference. I imported the Dreamcast in 1998 at the Japanese launch, and Virtua Fighter 3 was my jam for months. It wasn't arcade perfect, but comparatively, it was close, and that was saying something since the Model 3 was still one of the most powerful arcade platforms available for three-dimensional polygons. What made this time so special, however, was the fact the Dreamcast was directly based on the Naomi arcade standard, which meant you were getting games at home exactly how they looked, sounded, and played in the arcade. The games came fast and often, almost to the point where it was difficult to keep up. Fighting games and shoot 'em ups saw the lion's share of attention, and since I was an action game guy at the time, the Dreamcast easily lived up to its name by being a bona fide dream come true. But the Dreamcast was just the start of that generation, which saw 3 more consoles over the next 3 years, and each one brought something impressive to the table with huge visual upgrades over the previous generation. The PlayStation 2 could display a ton more polygons than its predecessor, so we started seeing games with far bigger play areas and much more complicated geometry. When Grand Theft Auto 3 hit, that one game damn near cemented the PlayStation 2's dominance that entire generation, and for good reason. While it wasn't the first of its kind, it did it in a way that felt like nothing you had played before. The size of the environment and your interactions within it all felt incredibly fresh and so far ahead of the stuff from the previous generation. The level of storytelling also saw big improvements as well. On-screen characters had visible emotions that grabbed you and held you like never before. Metal Gear Solid 3 took what had came before and made it bigger, added more to do, and made the previous adventures seem small in comparison. Another big side effect of all that extra polygon pushing capability was the games that had all kinds of issues with draw-in suddenly didn't have them anymore. Racing games, notorious for polygon draw-in at the horizon, pushed it so much further back you often didn't see it anymore. At least not anything like it was. Another big change was the amount of characters you saw on screen. Even with the Saturn and PlayStation working at their best, the amount of 3D models on the screen were often laughably low. That changed in a huge way in the 6th generation. When the GameCube and Xbox showed up in 2001, things got even better. Games looked sharper, ran smoother, and had more detail thanks to more advanced special effects, more rendering power, and more memory. Resident Evil 4 took what was once flat two-dimensional backdrops with fixed camera angles and turned it completely 3D with incredible detail. There are so many more games I could name drop, but you get the idea. The 6th generation was a massive improvement in technology that once again made the transition an exciting time, and I wanted to play everything I could get my hands on. To tell you the truth, it was probably the last time I felt that way as a fan of video games. I hope you guys enjoyed this brief look at the way the generational changes made a younger gamer like me feel. It was some exciting stuff to see new hardware show up, and it typically meant a big jump in presentation. A lot of times it meant closer arcade ports, but it also meant big improvement for games developed specifically for the home market. For a very long time I coveted new console hardware like you wouldn't believe. So much so, it motivated me to get a job at the young age of only 15, just so I could buy the things I really wanted. It was also the primary reason I began to investigate the import shops I found at the back of gaming magazines in the early 1990s. I wanted that hardware as soon as it was available, and that often meant looking to Japan. One of the most depressing aspects of modern gaming is that consoles today feel almost identical to each other in terms of look and feel, with small boosts to things like resolution and special effects. Hell, for a good decade now, most modern games all look the same to me, severely hampering my excitement for them. Truth be told, I am extremely grateful for the era I grew up in. The 8, 16, and 32-bit generations were magical times that filled me with a sense of wonder that continues to define the things I enjoy even now, some 30 plus years later. Technology advanced at a breakneck pace with huge strides in a very short amount of time. And for a kid like me, that made things incredibly fun and exciting. I wouldn't trade that time and that experience for anything. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.